So we've seen a lot of people who are kind of like worried. They've been commenting some of the episodes were like, oh, is this a Maoist channel now? Is this a tanky channel? One commenter was worried that I had taken the red pill, so to speak, and that my YouTube channel is basically now a big arsenal of tanks ready to roll over into Hungary and kill the counter-revolution. And I just want to assure everyone that this is true. I'm a tanky now.
I'm making curry now.
Curry is not a dish, it's a spice. What is curry? What is the dish of curry?
Curry soup, shall I say.
Oh.
Chicken curry soup, Thai style, as a
Okay.
matter of motherfucking factly.
So you have chicken and you have curry and you have water.
Coconut water.
Okay, so
Coconut milk. It's made.
okay.
Its base is coconut milk.
Okay, so you kill a coconut and then you take the fluid and it just fucking slit its coconut throat.
You know the Hawaiian myth for how coconuts came?
No.
So Maui, who's kind of like the center demigod.
Okay.
If you watch Moana, he's the big dude. There was an eel, the eel god.
The eel god?
The eel god, yes, the god of eels.
Is it the god of eels, or is it like a god who is like
The god of
an eel? He's not an eel himself.
That just depends on who told you, because it's not, it was oral tradition. So
Okay.
there are differences.
Sometimes an eel, sometimes not an eel.
Sometimes he's an eel, sometimes he's a person who is the god of eels.
Okay.
So that would be an interesting position to have. So what do you do for a living? Well, I'm a god of the eels.
What class position is that?
So anyways, he had a wife who left him.
Okay.
She
That
was
does
like, you know
suggest-
what? I'm fucking tired of living in the sea. Fuck you. I'm going on to land. And then on the land, Maui was like, hey, girl, let me hit you up. And then a little while later, the eel god was like, hey, fam, come on. And so they're like, all right, fine, we'll fight for her. And then they fought for her. And here's how they fought. They got super tiny. They went into the other person's body. Not fucking kidding. Then
Wait,
the eel god got super tiny, went into Maui, got out, and Maui was fine. And then Maui gets super tiny, gets into the eel god, and then fucking slices his head open from inside of the eel god. So fucking slices his head open and then becomes big again. And then he takes his head, and Maui's mom told him to put it on the corner of his house, bury it on a corner of his house, and then a coconut tree grew out of that.
So basically, the first coconut was this fucking eel god's head.
Yes. This is my heritage. This is where I come from.
Okay, so it's been how long? Like almost 4 months since we recorded last.
It's been a hot minute.
We're on schedule, I think. This is it's been like a 4-month-long week. This is we're still a weekly podcast, I think.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's just a little bit of a blip.
Yeah, we might change this. We might not. We'll see.
There also may be a channel change given the new political orientation.
Yeah,
The Black Rose doesn't necessarily work anymore.
the Black Rose does not necessarily work anymore. The name Kropotse Tung does not necessarily work anymore because Kropotkin, kind of dorky dude. I don't hate Kropotkin, but I'm not an anarchist anymore, so I wouldn't necessarily want him to represent my part in this endeavor.
Kropotkin was a pretty fucking cool dude as far as anarchists go, though. And I like anarchists. Let's not get me wrong here.
Kropotkin was pretty cool.
His best contribution, though, by far, radicalizing Mao. For those of you who don't know, Mao became an anarchist by reading Kropotkin, and then later became a Marxist.
Yeah, I mean Kropotkin was definitely way better than say Bakunin
Yes.
or fucking Proudhon.
Proudhon. Jeez.
Jesus, Proudhon was really fucking awful.
Yes. I will say this, though. I will always thank anarchists for being the ones who assassinated the guy who annexed Hawaii. Because I'm Native Hawaiian. So, thank you, anarchists, for assassinating the dude who annexed my homeland. My teacher once, when I was in high school, described William McKinley was assassinated by a deranged anarchist. And I was an anarchist at the time, and I was like, I happen to think that the guy was cool as shit.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about classes and class society, class analyses, what classes there are, what classes there are not. Just like getting a grip of what everyone thinks they has a grip on. Because everyone thinks they understand class society really well, but there's a lot more detail to it and a lot more nuance to it than people might think. So just for clarity, let's talk a little bit about capitalism and the class build-up, the class makeup of capitalism.
So the motive force of capitalism is the contradiction between the bourgeois and the proletariat. The bourgeois who own means production, and buy labor power from the proletariat who don't really own anything as far as production goes. And then there's the petty bourgeois who sort of vacillate in between these to differing degrees. There are petty B who are a lot closer to proletarians, and there are petty B who are a lot closer to bourgeois. But what is universal is that they do have interests that go both ways. And so in a political context, when you're organizing, it's you focus a lot about how you can focus on their proletarian aspect and find the unities. So anyways, the petty bourgeois is often a confusing one because everyone is complex. We all have different things about us that make us different as far as our class backgrounds go. So the petty bourgeois are oftentimes a difficult one to define. And these things are not necessarily black and white. They have to be interpreted. There is not a list that you can check off that determines whether or not someone is petty bourgeois or proletarian. Generally, oftentimes their relationship towards production is indirect. So it's management, if not management, then adminning or stuff that we see in offices where they're looking over data over production to try and make decisions for how we go forward in our productive capacity. So that's basically what makes them petty bourgeois, is that they do hold that sort of intermediary position. And being petty bourgeois can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. So this one, people get mad at me for, especially artists. Artists are generally petty B. They get very upset when I say this. Some of them don't. There are a fair amount. In organizing spaces, a lot of them are very much recognize the fact that they're petty B. But when they're sort of new and they want prole cred because they see it as some puritanical thing, they get very, very upset when you say that that artists are not proletarian.
So, could you say that being petty bourgeoisie does not necessarily mean that you benefit more from capitalism than you would from socialism?
That's a good question. It does vacillate. The thing that should be recognized is they're always being pulled in one direction or another. They're not static or staying in one place. And so over a long enough timeline, any petty bourgeois person will become bourgeois or they will become proletarian. Over a long enough timeline. A lot of them die before then. So let's not say that everyone dies proletarian or bourgeois. It depends on whether their character is primarily proletarian or primarily bourgeois. If we say musical artists, a fair amount of them are not going to be doing better under socialism than capitalism. For example, Kendrick Lamar, who I am a fan of, is not going to live a better life under socialism.
Yeah, no.
That is not going to happen. So you can be a millionaire and be petty B. Being a millionaire doesn't necessarily make you bourgeois, but it definitely makes you more bourgeois than proletarian on the petty B spectrum. And so, probably not going to be living a great life comparably under socialism. Probably going to be dang, I miss my mansion and my Lambo.
You know the Kinsey scale?
No.
The Kinsey scale where it's rates you I think 0 is a completely heterosexual and a 6 or 7 or something is completely
Okay.
Sexuality scale. I feel petite bourgeoisie, what we're kind of looking at is the different steps between 1 and 0 on that scale. If one of them is proletarian and one of them is bourgeoisie.
Yeah, I mean, and it's very complex. There's always different things that matter. So basically some of them, petty B people still have to work most of the time. A lot of them work on hourly wages, similar to proletarians. Yeah. It just depends. My friend, for example, works at a university in the diversity and inclusion office. Yeah, no, that's a petty B that's a petty B job for the most part, what he has, because it's like admin office shit. I have never worked in an office like that, so I can't say that I know too much about how it operates. But he seems pretty confident in the fact that he's petty bourgeois, and he doesn't even get paid all that much. So he like still has a lot of proletarian characteristics to him. He hates his boss for the same reason that every proletarian hates their boss. He doesn't get paid that much, and he lives in a working class community. That would be, one that's more proletarian and one that's easier to unite with.
So you could say that this person, despite being petty bourgeois, can still have a sort of proletarian outlook, and they can be like part of those people who will do better under socialism.
Yeah, and like whether or not someone does better, like that can be interpreted, obviously. Given that we analyze through dialectical materialism, we can't really predict what things are going to look like necessarily. But we can say that their outlook is more proletarian, and since it's more proletarian, it can be united, and it's socialist, communist perspectives can arise, and it has, and through like starting with that unity and other unities where they can be found, like he's a brown person, which is a good place to start. Like there are different places that you can find unity, and then build from there to build a like genuinely proletarian perspective. So, now he actually does have proletarian viewpoint despite being petty B. And, those tendencies are there, but primarily, the politics of proletarian. There are a lot of different ways that like being petty B can manifest itself. And it can even manifest itself in proletarian ways. Like you can be petty B and work minimum wage at a fucking like fast food place, depending on where your direction in life is. Right. And so like the direction where you are now, where your history is, all of that matters and accumulates. And there is no definite answer. It all depends on what your particular class analysis is. So it can change, and there will be disagreements, but it's still good to discuss these things and flatten out those disagreements to the best of you possible.
So we're talking about like classes and how they relate to like how your life will change as an effect of the establishment of socialism. And like there is this kind of this idea that basically all workers in the first world belong to like the labor aristocracy, and that they benefit more from capitalism than they do socialism. And would you say there's like any truth to that?
Yeah, I mean there is truth in it. Like people don't uphold that belief for no reason. Yeah, like the thing is about the first world, like I'm not a third worldist, so I don't believe that like almost the entirety of the first world like can't have a proletarian perspective. I think that generally the majority of people in the first world hold a proletarian perspective, but there is a lot of petty B in the first world, I think, is something that is not recognized a lot. And also petty B isn't a moral category. It's a class category. So like there are unities and disunities that exist among it. But like in the first world, yeah, it's true that labor and resources are extracted from the first world to create the particular style of living that we see under the first world today, which primarily represents itself in technology. And also like things like, fruit and whatnot, like, basic commodities are exploited and are you're given much easier access in the first world to these things. Like, I'm going to be traveling to the Philippines this summer. And so like we've been doing a lot of training with people who do this each year because it like, with my particular type of organizing, we do it a lot. So we're saying a little bit about how like there are people who farm on rubber trees all day and they can barely afford their sandals. In fact, they can't afford their sandals, which are made out of rubber. That generally doesn't exist here. There are things where like, people can't afford the shit that they produce, but regardless, we are given access to wealth that is exploited from the third world. However, I think what is a lot of the times looked over as far as what proletarians actually are looking for is a lot of the time it's stability. Because like even in the US, if you're working class, it's sometimes, totally possible for you to get a new iPhone every year or 2 years. In fact, every 2 years is super possible because if you have a data plan that gets you a new phone every 2 years, which is super common. And I think most proletarians in the first world would be okay giving that up for like not having to worry about evictions or not having to worry about like not having healthcare, because that's fucking terrifying. I say as someone who doesn't have healthcare and has a very shoddy relationship towards rent in a city where the rent is rising incredibly fast. Yeah, I already have a shitty, outdated phone regardless. So I'll keep my shitty phone and have less access to some of those. I will very much take access to housing and healthcare over that. And, like automobiles, like, people in the first world get new cars all the fucking time. And that is super unnecessary.
That is a strange phenomenon to me. Like, why do people do that?
I don't know. Personally, like, I'm somewhat of a car enthusiast. Like, I'm not a fucking gearhead, but like, to me, even maybe like this is sort of weird. I think this is just one of the cases where like my politics has influenced even just like my interests in basic things like cars. I don't want to fucking buy cars all the goddamn time. I'm totally cool. I got a car. I got a moped made in the 80s that's super shitty. I like working on it. I like just maintaining my shit and being able to keep that for a long time. That's so much fucking cooler to me. Plus, they just are cooler. Like, I think one of the things that you see about like Cuba and the car culture there, and I do understand, like, yeah, not a whole lot of people have cars in Cuba. However, what you do notice about the car culture in Cuba is that like they're a lot more individual because they are forced on lower resources. Like, the car culture there is just better. Like, they take pride in it. They work on it. They like individualize it. That like you can actually talk about them in ways that are interesting. I don't know why I'm going on a spiel about cars, but anyways, when we're talking about like, yeah, the first world and like the benefit of socialism and all that, our access to wealth is different, but it wouldn't necessarily lower our quality of life for a lot of proletarians. For a lot of people, like in the first world, it wouldn't necessarily be better. And I think a lot of people have this idea of like socialism being easy or like relaxed, which is just not the case, especially for petty B people. I think that that's something that a lot of petty B people are looking for because, under capitalism, a lot of petty B people are definitely still working very, very hard. So petty B people who become socialists, a lot of the time they have that perspective that's like, going to be easier, which it's not. Like, so I hate to break it to y'all middle class white folks who are interested in socialism. You gonna work. You gonna work, fam. You gonna work like we have. So I think that it's just different. I think a lot of people will have basically the same standard of living, but it's more stable as far as like things like housing and shit go. Like, you're not going to get evicted. And so it just depends on what your actual like interests are as far as like a lot of things go. Yeah. But certainly I do think that a fair amount of the petty bourgeois and even a fair amount of the proletarians, because there are proletarians here who make a lot of money, who are not going to benefit from the fall of imperialism. Because we're not just talking about socialism, we're talking about the fall of imperialism. Without that exploitation of the third world, like access to wealth is going to be a lot more difficult.
So just like before we go into like the more like some more intricacies of class society, I just want to give out a bit of advice. Fellow poor people, don't put yourself in debt to buy a car for like tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, that's fucking dumb.
So let's talk about some unclear examples, like, say, politicians, thieves, panhandlers, the unemployable, maybe like soldiers, mafia people, like high-up gang leaders.
So politicians represent a political dictatorship generally. They always represent a dictatorship of a certain class, as every political system does. So it really, it depends a lot. I think that if they represent a political dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, then it's fair to assess and call them bourgeois. And if they represent a dictatorship of the proletarians and they maintain that through their state apparatus, then I would say that'd be fair to call them proletarians.
But if we're talking about like in capitalist society, would we say that?
Oh, yeah, generally, pretty much always under capitalist society, they're bourgeois.
Yeah. Okay.
And some people will consider judges to be politicians because a lot of them actually do have to run for that position. And, that's where it gets a little bit like milky. I would consider like most judges to be petty bourgeois, upper petty bourgeois, but petty bourgeois nonetheless. So, and like, under feudalism, kings and whatnot actually directly own the means of production. And so in those situations, it's pretty clear. But one of the developments of capitalism is like where the dictatorship of the bourgeois, they don't necessarily like have a monopoly ownership over industries, which is sort of new.
And it's kind of like this. There's like a sort of like far separation.
Yeah.
Between these things that's not like really necessarily there all that much, but it still is like a thing.
Yeah, it's like the character is there, but like mechanically it's not there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's something that's relatively new about capitalism. Let's see what the other ones you said, like thieves and whatnot.
Yeah, thieves.
Now I'm gonna lump in drug dealers with that too. So they generally are what are called the lumpen proletariat. The word proletariat is used only because they don't actually have any access towards means of production. And so the lumpen proletariat are people who engage in antisocial, destructive behavior in order to maintain themselves financially. So yeah, like thieves, drug dealers, and a lot of people get upset that like I say that drugs and drug dealing is destructive to our community because I don't fucking know why people are so salty about that. But I don't know. I grew up around in a community kind of plagued by drugs. I was raised by a drug addict, a recovered one, but a drug addict nonetheless. And so, yeah, drugs are fucking incredibly destructive towards our communities, and we should not be cool with them. But also recognizing the background that people, or the reasons that people turn to drug dealing, it is out of desperation and out of poverty and capitalism. But that doesn't change the fact that it is destructive towards our communities and is used a lot of the time. Like the CIA was part of the introduction of crack cocaine into the Black community, especially in the US. And a lot of that contributed to the death of the Black Panther Party. So yeah, they're destructive towards our communities. And a lot of people want to just like make it seem like it's well, that's your own business. But like in reality, it's not. It affects all of us. That isn't necessarily to say that just legalizing it is the way to go, but I think that this like, oh, we can just be cool with it and it's all good, that a lot of people in socialist, progressive, communist spaces often initially have that perspective.
It is pretty easy to see how like hard drugs can be used like as a tool to prevent people from organizing, prevent people from being a threat.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a sedative.
Yeah.
Yeah, like sometimes it's good to ruin someone's life if you don't want them to be a political organizer. And drugs are a good way to go about that. So yeah, so they're lumpen proletariat. So they don't necessarily own production, and most of them come out of poor backgrounds and whatnot. But what they engage in is ultimately destructive. And on the flip side of that, when we have talked about like mafia bosses and cartel kingpins and shit like that, they're the lumpen bourgeois, which are by far, I think, the most interesting class under capitalism. Like when you talk about like Pablo Escobar, there's a reason that there's a show about him. Well, the fucker had an interesting life. The man who like came from pretty like poor background, just stumbled into cocaine, became one of the earlier people to do that, be one of the earlier people to like realize that people in the first world would fucking love cocaine. Became richer than like a number of countries. Almost became president of Colombia while acting like he wasn't a cocaine kingpin, which everyone fucking knew he was. There were Marxist groups who like looked up to the dude. He was like, nah, he's a progressive dude. He's a man of the people because he like donated a lot. And it's true. Like actually, a lot of communities did improve. Like they were the fucking money that came in helped out a lot of them. But yeah, no, there was a Marxist group that was engaged in armed struggle that like they were doing kidnappings. And yeah, they ended up working with fucking Pablo Escobar. Weird shit.
It's like it's not like just like that they thought he played a progressive role. He kind of actually did.
Yeah, no, he did to an extent. Ultimately, it was destructive, but there were a lot of communities that did significantly better because of the money that came in. And we can even see some of that in the first world too, whereas like actually it's true. Like there's a reason that people become lumpen. Is because they're like, for the most part, lumpen life is going to destroy you. You're going to end up in prison or dead. But some people like actually got out of the hood with that. Like they actually became like middle class, upper proletarian, or like petty bourgeois, or if not them, then their children. Like they got out of the hood with that shit. It's true. like, yeah, I mean, there's a reason that people turn to it, because it does fucking work for a lot of shit. But ultimately, it's still destructive towards our communities and our health and all that. And so that's why, yeah, it's lumpen. It's destructive. And so the lumpen bourgeois are just fucking weird and interesting. They just live these really, really weird lives because they do have all the excess surplus value, or not really surplus value. It's a bit weird to call it surplus value when you're like stealing shit. Although I guess, yeah, that sort of is a raw form of it. But like they have all this wealth that they own, but because they play like generally an illegal status, depending on where they are, they just have a really complex relationship that ends up manifesting itself in really weird ways, especially considering a lot of them come from working class backgrounds. And so some of the shit that they like want to do as rich people when they become rich is like, yeah, like fucking Pablo Escobar created a hippo problem in Colombia. In South America, a problem is wild hippos because he imported a bunch of them.
That is a very interesting thing to do.
Yeah,
I want to import a bunch of hippos. Those things are fucking big as well. They can't be easy.
They're dangerous as shit.
Yeah, like how do you like ship a bunch of hippos from a different continent to the point where they become wild and a problem?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess if you have like even one hippo that's like kind of out of control, you do have a problem. Like you don't need a lot of hippies for there to be a hippos for there to be a hippo problem.
Well, hippies as well.
Yeah, you don't need a lot of hippies.
Yeah.
Potentially more dangerous.
Psychologically dangerous are the hippies. But yeah, so the lumpen bourgeois are fucking interesting, man. They are interesting people. Cult leaders, I think a lot of cult leaders are can be considered lumpen bourgeois as well.
Wow.
I think that cult leaders can be considered like that.
That does give like an entirely new, even more interesting aspect to it.
Yeah, like Shom Asakara, the Japanese cult that carried out sarin attacks. It only killed like a few people, but they did carry out fucking sarin attacks on Japanese subways. And they're still around today to a smaller extent, but they had this fucking massive operation and a plan that probably would have been successful if not for just a couple of things. So they were planning on carrying out a massive sarin attack on Tokyo. They got a helicopter from Russia and they were producing sarin. They were going to make like a massive sarin attack on Tokyo, which would have killed a lot of people. Like it would have been the single most destructive event in human history.
Oh damn!
Yeah, no, like millions of people dying like within the span of a day. Like
that is
fucking terrifying. Like looking into them, they were fucking terrifying. Yeah, I don't know. We can talk about that. I feel like that would be an interesting show in and of itself. Is just talk about like how like terrifying some of the shit that they did. But they were like producing 1,000 AKs a year in a country that doesn't have a military.
So like it's funny because that's like the kind of interesting people you get in the lumpen bourgeoisie. In the actual bourgeoisie, the most interesting person you're gonna get is like fucking Elon Musk or something.
Yeah, the actual bourgeois are generally like kind of boring, but the lumpen bourgeois, they try and they go for some wild shit, man.
It's like normal bourgeoisie. The most interesting thing is like, oh, we're gonna like maybe go to Mars, and then you have like people going, fuck it, we're importing loads of hippos to South America, and we're gonna kill like fucking half of Japan.
Yeah, they were planning on taking over Japan and blaming it on the U.S., blaming the attack on the U.S. They had this massive plan that like was just like a few months away from being carried out before like shit happened and they got arrested and whatnot. And they would have done that like 2 years before 9/11 too. Like 9/11 is considered like, oh man, that changed. That would have been fucking nothing. Fucking nothing if they got away with their shit. The thing is that, yeah, a lot of the time the lumpen bourgeois are sort of public. Like they booked slots on primetime public Japanese television. Often. Like,
how did they booked it?
Yeah, like they performed shit on there like a lot of the time, and
so just like
they
calling up
they were a relatively public cult.
Just like calling up the TV company, like, "Yo, can we do some cult shit on TV?"
Yeah, and they paid for those. They paid for those slots.
What the fuck? Okay.
Yeah, their productive capacity was fucking bonkers. They created new forms of execution, mass executions. Like there was this thing where you like executed someone and then put them in this like metal thing that basically microwaved them and turned them into a goo, and then they would dispose of the body by pouring that into a river.
Jesus.
But
Christ.
over time,
Okay.
yeah, that's pretty fucking awful, right? Well, over time, like a crust would form on the metal like thing, and so they would have to get rid of it. Well, after they arrested and raided all their shit, they found 84 of those with like a bunch of crusts so that they weren't usable anymore. It's not quite certain how many people have to be used in those before they're unusable. So there's just a bunch of these metal like tank things with some kind of human crust around them that could be multiple people. Yeah, right. And these motherfuckers were on public TV, and sometimes they were like, the reason that they got caught with the sarin attacks, even though like the sarin attacks were an attempt to get the police off of them, they tried to like blame it on someone else. Well, the thing is that sometimes when they were on public TV, they were singing about sarin gas. So by the time that they committed a sarin attack, it was pretty obvious. It was like it's these people it's this cult who was singing about sarin. That's not a hard thing to figure out. If they didn't do that, if they weren't a little bit dumber, yeah, like they would have committed a massive world-changing event. So yeah, anyways, in essence, what I'm saying is the Lumpen Bourgeois are a very, very fascinating class.
Let's talk a little bit about the military wing of the bourgeoisie.
I would generally consider it petty bourgeois. There are a lot of disagreements with that, but I consider it petty bourgeois just because like it's aspiration and its character, and like the maintenance of bourgeois society without like actually having credible control over production. I would generally consider that petty bourgeois. So that applies to soldiers and cops, but also depends. Like 5-star generals, bourgeois, because they are actually like on a high state level coordinators of the dictatorship of the bourgeois.
I think a lot of people, when I say people, I mean like a lot of communists, almost think about like cops. They almost think of them as a class unto themselves.
Yeah, I don't think that that's accurate, because like the petty bourgeois can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. I think what needs to be recognized.
I do think the main discussion that has been going on between people is like, are these people proletarians or are they something else? So we've been talking a lot about this from like a Marxist perspective, which is like what this show is about. So let's like contrast this in some way. Let's like compare this to what people normally have as an idea of like classes. Let's compare this to like sort of liberal class analysis that we have out there.
Yeah, so like generally the liberal class analysis is like based on income rather than relations. And so basically they see class as the result of income, whereas Marxists would say that your class is defined by your relationship, and your relationship will most of the time define your income. So income is a product of class. That I think sums up pretty much everything. So the Marxist analysis of class is based on where you are in the productive process of things. Because under capitalism, there aren't, for the most part, places where there are things separate from production, even if it's not part of the producing part of production, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and like what this kind of lets you see is like that the liberal class analysis is so ahistoric, like it breaks down if you apply it to any other period in history.
Yeah, like under feudalism, there was a lot of the time there aren't currencies. Sometimes there are, but for the most part, there are not currencies under feudalism. So like if you're just talking about income when income isn't really a thing and things are bartered and the raw source of production is generally based in agriculture, it would seem like a farmer can sometimes basically be in the same position as an artisan or like a blacksmith or whatever. And that just doesn't work.
Yeah, and even if you're like saying, okay, we're not going to look at income, we're going to look at like wealth. We're going to look at the quantity of things that you have. That's still not going to like show you classes in a clear way. Like it can give you more indication, like a king is going to have a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, it will help you understand the complexity of it for sure, but that's not definitive.
Yeah, it still like shows you the class as a function of the amount of wealth instead of looking at it the other way around. That it's that your wealth is a function of your relationship in the productive process.
And also what that doesn't really talk about, what like a liberal class analysis can't really do very well, is talk about the actual interests. I mean, there are things that people who make less have common in interest, and people who make more have common in interest. And so that's where a lot of the debate in like liberal political spaces actually goes, is it talks about things like, rent or whatever, or healthcare and stuff like that, welfare. Well, these are the interests, and that's true, but that only is true in a immediate and reformist lens.
Yeah.
As far as like a long-term perspective, a historical perspective, history is not made by those who are contained within a bracket of income. The bracket of income just is not like the primary perspective that changes where people go in history.
Yeah.
Where people go in history as far as like mass movements go is based on like your actual perspective based on your relationship.
And like a liberal is going to look at like class society and go like there's not necessarily a contradiction here, whereas the Marxist class analysis is like based on dialectical materialism.
Yeah, so it's based on that contradiction.
So it's going to like be better at identifying these contradictions. It's going to be more useful in that regard.
Because the liberal class analysis is only useful for reformist means, and even like a Marxist can use that on occasion for some things, like want lower rent. And if people are unitable on that area based on liberal class analysis, then it's possible to use that for the short term to get lower rent, because that's nice. Lower rent is really, really nice.
But you're not going to be able to organize a revolution.
Yeah, no revolution is made on an income basis.
So are there any like within like the subcategory of Marxist class analysis, are there any particular things that are only present in Maoism or are like especially present in Maoism?
So Maoists are a little bit like more broad in calling things petty bourgeois, as you could probably tell with me. I call a lot of things petty bourgeois in the first world, especially. And that's something that you'll see as a tendency among Maoists. You'll find Trotskyists to be a lot less that way. Like they'll be less likely to call things petty bourgeois and more likely to classify what Maoists would call petty bourgeois as proletarians. And there are a lot of so-called Marxists who just straight up don't really get these class divisions at all, because it is a hard thing to understand, actually. And so a lot of people like that is the basis of Marxism, but a lot of people don't start at the base, and that's fine. But a lot of people do start at a more like political rather than ideological level, I guess. What I generally like to classify it into ideological, political, and organizational when we're talking about these things, is that like some people are like, dang, I really don't like the organizational framework that one thing or another goes for, so I go for another thing because I like the organizational framework that goes for. The ideological is the historical perspective and the historical analysis and whatnot and everything that goes into that. And political is more like immediate, I guess. Political is like the analysis of current conditions. Like the historical analysis is what guides our political and organizational perspective. So like there are differences in ideological perspectives that like create these different class analyses.
Okay, so
and organizational analysis as well.
Going back to Trotskyist and the fact that they don't use the term petit bourgeois as much, do you think that's like maybe because they have like a more mechanical view of this and they're more likely to just like look at the descriptions of, oh well, petit bourgeois means you own,
like they like oftentimes it seems like they only give that name to like people who are like managers, like that actual like mechanical intermediary. I think that that's fair. I will say that I don't know too much about Trotskyist ideology.
I don't know shit about Trotsky. Like,
right.
From my understanding, they're just very all over the place.
Yeah.
And like, someone's brand of Trotskyism is not going to be the same as someone else's brand of Trotskyism. And what's universal of them is just that they're all bad.
Fair. But generally, I've seen Trotskyists consider like a lot of admin type office work to be considered like proletarian, which is not an accurate thing. And so like, yeah, with like standard ML, revisionist ML, we see, and this actually came from Stalin, is that sort of this mechanical view results in thinking that class struggle like ends under socialism. And that's not necessarily the case. it's often thought that because it's so mechanical in this way, that like if dictatorship of the proletariat has been set up, then the bourgeois does not exist anymore, which isn't necessarily true. Because, you know, if we're not being mechanical, then we know that these influences still exist.
So are we talking about like the bourgeoisie outside the country here, or is there like a bourgeoisie that can develop inside the socialist country itself?
They can develop inside the socialist country itself. In fact, I forgot exactly what Mao said, but when Mao was talking about it, he was like, the bourgeois didn't go away. They became part of the Communist Party. Because there are certain like jobs that are necessary to like keep production going, to like not just have everything collapse, which if everything collapsed, then like outside imperialist forces would take over and destroy everything. But in order to prevent that, there are certain jobs that are set up, which sometimes for some people will create a bourgeois consciousness. And when they are given certain amounts of power, their position politically will influence this, which is how like they will actually take on a bourgeois perspective and actually push for bourgeois changes. And so this is how capitalist restoration happens, because socialism is not a system in and of itself, but it's actually where class struggle is heightened. So Stalin said that class struggle was over internally. He said that there were no more exploiting classes in the USSR, and therefore internal class struggle was over. Whereas Mao said that class struggle heightens under socialism. This is actually where class struggle is at its peak, which means that if it's a struggle, it can be taken one direction or another. And so if it's a struggle, then the bourgeois can win that struggle. And so that's how capitalist restoration happens, is sometimes the perspective or the influence of bourgeois can become internal and create a new bourgeoisie within the Communist Party, or if not a new bourgeoisie, the remnants come influencers to start to change things into capitalism, which is what we saw in the USSR, which Mao identified as capitalist restoration in the USSR. And so that's why the Cultural Revolution was launched, which was not like the Communist Party checking itself. It was the masses checking the Communist Party.
So when like anarchists are talking about like the red bureaucracy, or like, I don't know, the red bourgeoisie, I don't know, like a bureaucratic class in socialist countries, like there can be a truth to that, but it's not like...
Yeah, there is a truth to it. There is a reason that people have that perspective. It's kind of understandable that people would come to those conclusions when you do see that people who were in the Communist Party would end up becoming the new bourgeois. They had a bourgeois perspective, and so they used their political power to create a bourgeois system. That's how capitalist restoration happened. And so it happened in different ways. In the USSR, it was primarily like militarily, like people who worked in or operated military production or were high-ups in the military were a heavy part of the revisionist and tendencies that restored capitalism in the USSR. And so as a result, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army in China, the Chinese military, was stripped of all its, like basically all of its political power in order to not let that happen. But it ended up being that like people who were in charge of like shops and shit would end up being the ones who would push for bourgeois reforms, and ended up turning the class struggle into a win in that particular case. Because as I said before, it is a struggle towards the bourgeois. So like, yeah, anarchists end up developing this perspective for a reason, and it is legitimate. But what's necessary, I think, is for the masses to be able to be given the political consolidation, which is something that is very difficult to do, like without some kind of authority anyways, because for someone to be taught, there has to be a teacher. And so there has to be consolidation. And so this is sort of where it's why balance is so important, is that you can have the fact that oftentimes people who are given power for like proletarian political reasons can take up a bourgeois perspective and become counter-revolutionary, while still recognizing their necessary and legitimate role for consolidating the masses so that the masses can end up checking them. So like people who are politically advanced will be given certain political power in order to consolidate the political consciousness of the masses, so that the masses are able to check them when they start pushing bourgeois lines.
Yeah, like what?
So it's something that constantly has to be balanced, something that's very complex, something that has a lot of different moving parts.
What kind of like made me more interested in Maoism than like other types of Marxism is like that when you are an anarchist, you have this idea of a very clear contradiction between the leadership of a given country and its people. And Maoism seemed to be the ideology that could have like this theoretical analysis and historical analysis, but also had like a method of dealing with this contradiction.
Yeah, and I think that that's why a lot of anarchists end up becoming Maoists. It's definitely like when I was sort of done with the anarchist analysis of things, I still had that perspective, and Maoism was really the only thing that ended up being able to answer that.
Yeah.
So a lot of the anarchists or a lot of Maoists in the first world at least come from that perspective. In the third world, Maoists just become Maoists like almost immediately, as far as like their first introduction towards communist political thought, because there are actual like revolutions going on. So when there's an actual revolution going on, that's just like, well, it's there. So it's what people often are the first, like, it's exactly where they go to.
I think there's kind of important for us people who live in the first world to realize, and this seems to be a common development that like a lot of us have developed from like this kind of very individualist liberal kind of thing. I find that it almost always starts with like liberal and also like very hard focus on like some sort of individualism, and then that goes into anarchism, and anarchism goes into something actually useful. Not to say anarchism is not useful.
Fucking shade. The dude who started this podcast as an anarchist is throwing way more shade than anyone else.
I do not hate anarchists, and I do think anarchism has useful aspects to it.
Yeah, I don't know. There was a Maoist in the U.S. who I think had a good little quote that I enjoyed. Was like, I can get along with an anarchist more than I can with some reformist ML, because at least an anarchist knows how to throw a fucking brick. I like that. It's good shit.
Speaking of good quotes, Mao said that in class society, everyone lives as a member of a particular class, and every kind of thinking, without exception, is stamped with the brand of a class. So, like, when we were talking about class analyses before, and like the liberal versus like Marxist class analysis, like obviously these two different kinds of things are stamped with the brand of a class. But like, would you say that the liberal class analysis is like a kind of a bourgeois way of thinking? Because like as a proletarian, that you can like spontaneously reach that conclusion, that is the analysis you have.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is a bourgeois way of thinking, because it is because it maintains a perspective that can only really be rationalized through reformist means. If you take a perspective that is progressive, then it's still like only reformists that perspective like that analysis like leads itself to. So yeah, no, it's absolutely true. What he says is everyone lives as a member of a particular class, and every kind of thinking without exception is stamped with the brand of a class, not the brand of the class that they take up. Okay. Although that exists as well. So like a liberal perspective or like a liberal class analysis, a bourgeois liberal class analysis will exist with a proletarian. However, a proletarian will always have at some internal level a proletarian understanding, while ultimately like what they will be pushing forward will be bourgeois through the liberal way. They will inherently have proletarian perspective to some extent. So every like person from a certain class will have an aspect of the thinking in whatever class they come from, but also every type of thinking has a branding of a certain class. So a liberal understanding is inherently a bourgeois understanding, even if it comes from a proletarian.
Okay.
And so this does apply to literally everything. Like when he said every type of thinking, he meant it. So whether that's like how you deal with family issues, like especially in my particular kind of organizing space, a lot of what we end up talking about is like organizational development, which oftentimes can be sort of compared to like figuring out your life and shit, like that's like doing that on a collective level is a very important part of the organizing that we do internally. Like, we're there for each other, and that's like really important. So, but we're class conscious when we do it. So we start thinking like this sort of perspective and attitude that you take towards romantic relationships. Obviously, this perspective leads to some problems. Is it rooted in like petty B shit? Because oftentimes it is. Oftentimes the perspective that they have that leads to like personal problems that we end up working out for each other Like we recognize like what kind of thinking is this? Is this proletarian, or is it bourgeois, or is it petty B? A lot of the time it's like rooting out petty B tendencies in ourselves, and that's kind of that's what we do, because we do recognize that every kind of thinking has some kind of class aspect to it, every kind. And so really like where we end up being with all of this, when we talk about like the different classes that exist and how it manifests itself, like it's super important to like think about these things, because this is how we get all the different types of thinking that we have to address when we're engaged in our political work, because everyone's coming from different perspectives based on where they are. And so understanding that class perspective, understanding that class analysis and the influences that they have is ultimately like the guide for almost everything that we do. And with that, always remember,
You have nothing to lose but your chains.